Thank you again for having me here. I must admit that it is a special occasion for me. You will soon find out why. This week, all over the world, people are marking 20 years for 1325 UN Security Council resolution, and I will give a global and local look at it. And I'll start by, you introduced me generously, so I will start by introducing Itach Maachi. Itach Maachi is with you in Hebrew and in Arabic, Women Lawyers for Social Justice. This is the NGO that I've been part of for 8 years now. Our NGO advances women's rights in Israel, focusing mainly on women from marginalized communities, among them Arab women, ultra-Orthodox women, migrant women, low-income workers, women living in poverty, and more. We are working on the policy and grassroots levels simultaneously in all of our initiatives, as we in Itach Maachi believe that meaningful social change can happen when both shifts occur. And in this capacity, Itach Maachi has been working for many years to advance the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which is celebrating, which is a big word, a bit of a sad 20th birthday these days. So we'll start by going back 20 years ago and recalling the basic principles in order to make a common ground for everyone who knows or doesn't know 1325. The 3 Ps, the 3 principles of 1325, participation. Women are, according the resolution, demand from all countries that women who are distinctly impacted by war must take an active role in solving and preventing conflicts and in peace building. Protection. It is clear that women and children are uniquely affected by armed conflict. We will talk about this. This is an important new acknowledgement. And the prevention of violence, acknowledging women as playing an important role in the prevention and resolution of conflict and in peace building. The resolution begins with an important context reminder saying, bearing in mind the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and the primary responsibility of the Security Council under the Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security, meaning this is not a gender equality rights resolution. It's a resolution that aims at solving violent conflicts. And it is important to remember that, and also to remember that this was the first time the UN Security Council ever referred to women or to gender in its decisions, 20 years ago. Moreover, the decision recognized for the first time the grave impact that armed conflict have on women and girls, and on the same time, the absence of women from decision-making positions in issues of peace and security. In other words, it realized that the people who are mostly impacted by violent conflicts are the least heard and least influential on the possibilities of ending these conflicts. You see here pictures, random pictures of negotiation tables and signing tables of peace treaties, normalization treaties, as you can see from Versailles 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, through Yugoslavia, peace accord in the caricature where you have the good guys and the bad guys, and the Madrid Peace Conference, the big with a big table with almost no woman around, and the normalization agreement signed a few weeks ago at the White House. Almost no woman, and it is important to remember that even if you can spot one woman around the table, at the table, is futile. in business, there are evidence and research that shows that when there are 30%, at least 30% women in decision-making positions, then you can see the change and the difference. So a little bit more background about 1325. It was the outcome of intensive efforts of women's organization, and it followed several international incentives. One was the press coverage of the use of rape as weapon in the war in Rwanda and in Bosnia in the 90s. It wasn't a new weapon, as we all know, but it was the first time the world witnessed that in a way that it couldn't ignore it, I think. Parallel to that, the peace agreement in Northern Ireland was signed, ending a long and bloody conflict thanks to a major influence of women, the coalition of Northern Ireland women, who were not only a key to getting the peace agreement, but also helped to create a long-lasting agreement with articles. The women there insisted on dealing with the issue of the day after the agreement will be signed, rebuilding trust throughout education, and the need to acknowledge the suffering of the enemy. After the resolution is passed, there was a lot of research being done on this issue, and research done that was published in 2015 by UN Women measured the presence of women in 182 signed peace agreements between 1989 and 2011, and showed that when women participated, the greatest impact was on the long term of the agreement. An agreement is 35% more likely to last at least 15 years when women are involved. Another study that looked at 40 cases of peace negotiations, not necessarily negotiations that led to peace agreements, showed that women's participation led to a likelihood of reaching an agreement. Women were perceived as trustworthy members of society in these cases, and it helped build public support. There were more, it also impacted the text of the agreement. An analysis of 98 peace agreements between 2000 and 2016 showed that agreements are more likely to have gender provisions when women participate. And women's inclusion was associated with higher chance that the agreement will be implemented. Now I want to go dive into several case studies. I want to bear in mind before we do that it is, I often hear when I'm lecturing to Israeli people and to people around the world, many examples of women that did not bring to peace or do not bring feminist or women's rights perspective to the decision-making tables. So it is important to know and to remember that women's participation is crucial, but it is not sufficient. And now I want to run through several interesting examples from recent years, raising different issues regarding 1325. The first one is Colombia. If you don't know a lot about the conflict in Colombia, it is important to know that it was 50 years of bloody armed conflict with more than 220,000 people who were killed. Almost 6 million people were displaced. And in 2012, began a new round of peace talks that were considered to be another round of peace talks that no one really thought would work. And there was only one woman out of 20 negotiators. And then women organizations from across the country held a big conference demanding the implementation of the principles of 1325 resolution. And after their campaign, at least a third of each side were women. Another very important thing that was unique about this negotiation process was that it was the first ever gender subcommission that was part of the negotiation team. And women maintained peace on local level, also helped to negotiate local ceasefire. And in 2016, an historic peace agreement was signed between the government and the FARC. As you can see in the picture, no women in the picture, but there were a lot of women on a third of each part of each delegation were women at least. And I think we need to remember and to ask also ourselves, why weren't there women on that picture? But there was the agreement was signed, and it was considered in many ways a 1325 agreement. It is not everything there is pink. Colombia has failed. Nowadays, there's a lot of criticism that Colombia has failed to implement around half of its gendered provision in the peace accord, and the peace is very fragile. But the women were very influential and considered to be crucial to achieve the agreement. The second example I want to bring is the Philippines, and here we have a woman, and not only that, Miriam Coronel Ferrer was the first female and the only female until now female chief negotiator to have signed a major peace accord in 2014. Lately, she published an article towards the 20th anniversary of 1325, saying that on the ground, do you see the quote on top? On the ground, many women are working to advance peace and security agendas, but we need to be recognized and visible at the highest levels as well. I think this is something that we need to recall when we'll start to speak about Israel, because this gap between many peace movements and many peace activists that are female and are feminist peace activists, and the gap between them and their absence in decision-making bodies in these issues is a gap that hasn't been bridged yet at all over the world. In the Philippines, women were 33% of negotiators, and they were a quarter of the total signatories, and served as advisor to both sides, to both delegations. And they took part in track 2 and track 1 process, which is something that we see in many peace processes in the last years, that they started to implement 1325 in track 2, in informal peace negotiation. And this is something that we in Itach מעכי want to encourage and to implement in Israel also. Next, I want to take a look at Sudan. It doesn't really have a connection with the latest news about Sudan and Israel. I don't know if you know this picture, but it was quite viral. It was the picture of Ala Salah, who on April 10th was photographed on a rooftop of a car in the protest against the president. The president, the next day, the picture went viral, as you can see already from the pictures and on all the mobiles taking her photos. And this was the day after that, the following day, the military arrested the president. And it is important to state that women made up around 70% of the protesters demanding the removal of the president. this led to a gender violent action against protesters. As you can see, the message officers in Sudan received were break the girls, because if you break the girls, you'll break the men. This was a year and a half ago in Sudan. Soldier arrested women, took them to secret detention sites where they were photographed naked and threatened with sexual violence. After that, they dropped them in front of their houses in order to humiliate them and their families. Husbands began to divorce their wives out of shame. Fathers beat their daughters into submission in an attempt to keep them at home. And the last case study I want to refer to is here in Israel and the Four Mothers movement. We're going to talk now about, in a few seconds, about how Israel implemented 1325 resolution. But the Four Mothers movement that started at the late 90s, it was the movement that led to the withdrawal of Israel from Lebanon. And what you see here is an illustration from a documentary that was just released a month ago, and I highly recommend you to see it. And the documentary depicts the process of how these women started to protest and to demand the withdrawal from Lebanon. They were slandered, of course, treated as naive. And the other thing that is very interesting to mention is, as you can see in this illustration, it's a mother pushing a cradle. And the cradle, as you know, in Israel, the boys and the girls are it is a symbol of how people are referring to the fact that when they are born, there is another soldier that is born. But this is, apart from this, I think it also points at a dilemma that I don't think that we can solve on what does it mean? Does every mother have a motherly instinct? Does it have any direct connection between being a female, being a mother, and wanting to promote peace? This hasn't been resolved, and I don't think we will find the resolution for that now. But I think that this image is something that I have in mind when I'm promoting 1325 in Israel. Now let's go directly to the implementation in Israel. In July 2005, 5 years after the resolution was passed, Israel was the first UN member to create a legislation based on 1325. It was an amendment to the 51 Equality Women's Rights Law. With this legislation, Israel committed itself to ensure proper representation of women on all national policy-making committees and teams, including peace and security issues and peace negotiations. And it also demanded representation of women from diverse communities. This is very important and groundbreaking legislation in Israel. However, it wasn't implemented. So during the following years, and actually until now, איתך, מעכי, and also together with other organizations, we're doing a monitoring, legal monitoring of the implementation of the law. We submitted 8 petitions until now to the High Court of Justice. What you see here is a caricature that was published in Haaretz newspaper after we submitted the petition in the case of the Tirkel Committee that was established and was supposed to examine the flotilla event, and there wasn't any woman there. And the reason why it got to the caricature in Haaretz is because it was the first time that the High Court said, okay, stop the deliberations. You need to add a woman to the committee. You cannot ignore the law anymore. I must admit that there wasn't a woman eventually, and we continued on monitoring the implementation. Just recently, we filed a petition against the Corona Experts Committee that the National Security Council and the government assigned in March and April, and there were 23 experts with no woman at all. But petition after petition, we did see an improvement in the representation of women in government committees, but it was clear, and it is still clear, that even if the law will be fully implemented, there isn't a holistic strategy that can assure equal and diverse representation of women, and there is no emphasis on the field of peace and security. Meanwhile, around the world, 86 countries already have a national action plan to implement 1325, including Lebanon that just joined, I think, during the summer. Some of the countries have a second and a third revised national action plan that is also based on more civil society consultation, that is also has a budget. And we realized, when I'm saying we, I mean women's organizations and civil society organizations, we realized that Israel government is not going to do that. So during 2012 and 2014, over 30 women's organizations, activists and academics from diverse backgrounds participated in roundtables and together composed an Israeli action plan according to the civil society. It was something that hasn't been done in nowhere else in the world. And in the introduction to the action plan, you can find a definition for security that these activists and organizations wrote together. A security that is based on the notion and the principle of 1325 to see security in a gender perspective. After we composed the action plan, we had a big 1325 campaign. We had Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, greeting us on an international conference, and it was an amazing campaign. And it even led to a landmark government decision on December 14, the Israeli government committed to create an action plan to advance the principles of 1325. By the way, it doesn't mention 1325 or the UN, which is problematic sometimes for Israeli government to mention in its resolutions. But it did refer to the principles, and in the explanatory part, it refers directly to 1325. It mandated the creation of an interministerial committee to form a national action plan in line with UN Security Council Resolution 1325. It demanded consultation with civil society organizations and to strengthen women's protection from all sorts of violence. We are now almost 6 years after that, and this resolution hasn't been implemented yet. Actually, it had a timetable of 180 days, which has passed. But why am I still optimistic? That's a good question. Because there is a gap between declarations and government advancement and the grassroots. After the landmark government resolution, we, איתך, מעכי, together with Women Wage Peace Movement, which I hope you know. If not, I think it's very important to know, and Adam Institute, we held seminars to train 500 women from diverse groups in society in the fields of 1325. Our goal was to give legitimacy, this is how I call it, to women to be influential in peace and security discourse, but as civilians. And this is something that is very important to me to emphasize here, because in our opinion, and based on the 1325 principles and the 1325 implementation around the world, what is the main and the most important thing here and tool that 1325 gives us is the legitimacy to be active and influential and part of decision making, not as ex-generals and not in order to sound like the general that sits next to me in the table that I had the chance of being elected because they needed one woman. No, to create a new voice, gender voice, human voice to conflict and to security issues. But then we zoomed out or zoomed in, and we are here all in the Zoom, and we had the COVID-19. We still have. We're in the middle of that all over the world. And I want to do this zoom in to the COVID-19 crisis as a 1325 case study. And why is that? First of all, I think this is well known by now that COVID-19 crisis had a grave impact on women. Although men are more likely to face health complications from COVID-19, women are suffering from more social and economic challenges than men. More women lost their jobs during the pandemic in Israel and around the world. The number of requests, this is just an example, in Israel, the number of requests to fire pregnant women in Israel went from an average of 1,000 per year to 15,000 this year, when 90% of them were approved. Domestic violence has risen, as you know, with reports of abuse being reported on much higher level than usual because of tension, because of lack of security and social and economic security also, and uncertainties. During the first lockdown in Israel, there were reports of domestic abuse centers rose 50%. The UN Secretary General said in the beginning of the crisis that COVID-19 could reverse the limited progress that has been made on gender equality. And I want to quote a partner of mine in the 1325 steering committee of our project, saying on the first day of the lockdown in March, she said the stay-at-home order ignores the fact that women, that home is not a safe place for these women. In Israel, it's more than 1,000 women that live in violent houses. And women's rights in the beginning and still were neglected and ignored. And the reason was quite clear. As I mentioned, in the beginning of April, we found out that the government council appointed an all-male experts team. But there is a good outcome of that. We filed a petition together with the Rachman Center and on behalf of 13 organizations. And after the petition was filed, the National Security Council appointed a new committee, and in that committee there is a majority of women, and it is led by a woman, and there is an ultra-Orthodox woman and an Arab woman. I must emphasize that in all of our petitions, and especially in the last petition, we demanded to have not only that the committee will have that we have women in the committee, but to have women from groups in society, women that are marginalized and are not heard in decision-making bodies often. And as you also know, a lot of people and a lot of news items are talking about the women leadership in the COVID-19 crisis around the world. So according to a study that was published in The Guardian a few weeks ago, on average, countries led by women were quicker to lock down and had fewer deaths. Male-led countries suffered 6 times more death due to COVID-19 than female-led countries. This is, in the parenthesis, there's an anecdote that as of October, the White House staff has more cases of COVID-19 than of New Zealand and Taiwan combined. But it's an anecdote, I must admit. But what isn't an anecdote is an attempt, and there are many attempts to try and point at what are the characteristics of feminist leadership in the COVID-19. And I took out some of them. One that you can see in many research is pointing at the transparency and in the leadership and a willingness to admit mistakes publicly, and empathy to people that are now suffering, to people from groups in society that suffer more, acknowledging that it's a difficult time, speaking to children. By the way, in Norway, in March or April, the Norwegian Prime Minister held a press party to children in order to explain to them. She realized that they are going through it. They are also suffering, as we all know. And setting human security goals as standard. In this table, you can see they are measuring countries that are that have the same population, more or less: New Zealand and Ireland, Germany and the UK, and Bangladesh and Pakistan. So I think, and this is something that you see in many of the research and many of the publication, we cannot summarize still the COVID-19 and the influence of women leadership on COVID-19. We are not at the end of it, but we can seek some of the characteristics. And this leads me back to 1325 and to the question of feminist leadership in general and in the peace and security discourse. What does it mean, and are we ready for that? What you see here in the first picture, this is Margot Wallström. She was the foreign affairs minister of Sweden. And she was, she, by the way, is going to be a guest of us in one of our events to mark the 20 years for 2025. So I will be happy to share with you the details, but it's going to be on November 26th. It's going to be our closing event. By the way, this is our opening event of the events marking the 20 years to 1325. And we're going to ask her, what does it mean, feminist foreign policy? Because when she got into office on her first or second day, she declared that she's going to have a feminist foreign policy. The years that followed that, she and the Foreign Ministry of Sweden tried to understand what does it mean, and they published a handbook on feminist policy, feminist foreign policy, which is exactly at the core of peace and security, the core of 1325. But I also put this picture. I could found a picture of Margot Wallström alone, but this is a part of a newsletter headline that I ran into a few years ago when she was still the foreign minister, and I don't know if you remember, but she got a lot of criticism, not only in Israel. She acknowledged the state of Palestine. This is why she was very much criticized in Israel, but she was also she had lots of criticism in Saudi Arabia, where she refused to go on with the deliberations until they will resolve issues of gender equality. And she leading this feminist policy was not an easy thing. Wasn't granted. Wasn't taken for granted, and wasn't welcome easily. And in this newsletter headline, in the above headline, you see that she's saying, "Please don't say that I'm anti-Semitist." And in the other title beneath, it refers to a big article in the newsletter, in the newspaper, that was dealing with young women who lost their boyfriends, soldiers, boyfriends who died in the last Gaza war, military operation, and about how they are still connected to the mothers of these soldiers. And I think that this newspaper really emphasizes this gap that we still have between how it is we women do have the place in the peace and security discourse to suffer from the consequences of conflict. And this is something that is acknowledged, that women are suffering from it, but whenever they are near a political, when they have a political seat and a political decision-making position in this field, they are often very much criticized, sometimes and often more than men. Under the title of Feminist Leadership, I couldn't not put Jacinda Ardern, and this was her reaction to the massacre in the mosque, and this was called in newspapers around the world the hugging policy. I don't have any problem with that. No doubt it was before Corona, the hugging policy. Now we can't have the hugging policy. This is a problem. And I also wanted to remind us all, Yuval and all others here, all other male partners here, that this is not only a job for women. In order to bring feminist leadership, you don't need to be a female. And when Trudeau, for example, had 50% of his government with women, and said this famous line, because it's 2015, and this is something that is very important. I don't think that only women are feminist and only women can bring feminist leadership. Men can too and should, and it is important. I go back and remind ourselves what is the goal of 1325. It's not to promote gender equality, but to promote conflict resolution. And another way, because I'm speaking to you and the students, I thought it is important to let you know that there are research and all sorts of recommendations. This was just published a few days ago by Georgetown Institute of Women, Peace and Security, call for action to enhance diversity and equality in international affairs education. They have a list of suggestions of how you can do that in your courses, in your and in your curricula. So when we're going back to, I'm ending now, so I just want to have one last look at the global process of 1325. Women continue to be placed around the table and not actively at the table all around the world. Women are still a minor percentage of peace process negotiating teams. Most agreements still don't have gender equality provisions in them, in the agreements. And as you can see here, only 20%, almost 20% included provisions addressing women, girls, and gender. And there are always the quite frustrating numbers about the global share of parliamentary seats held by women, which is around 24%. And the average in conflict and post-conflict countries stands at 19%. And the global political empowerment gap will currently take 108 years to close if we continue on the current rate. But as I told you in the beginning, I am an optimist. So I want to end on an optimist note, and also to refer to Corona and COVID-19, because I do think that one of the positive, if we can say positive about Corona and COVID-19, the positive outcomes of this crisis, is that maybe for the first time the word security was viewed in Israel, and I don't think that it's only in Israel, but I'm working here. It was referred not only in its militant sense. Women and men from diverse groups in society realized, feeling it on their own flesh and blood, that health security and job security are crucial part of their notion of security. This is a great achievement for Israel. The Security Council that I mentioned before, which is a male-dominant body of the government, for the first time, as I said, has now an experts team with a majority of women and is dealing with health and security and education and domestic violence and welfare. So I hope that this new definition is here to stay, also for our usual crisis times, the conflict that truly needs a human and gender perspective. Thank you.